What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing well. What do you know about processed foods? Well, as a trainer of 14 years, I thought I knew quite a bit. But then I talked to the guest that you're about to hear from, and I realized that my understanding of processed foods was very limited compared to what there is to know out there. So buckle up and get excited to learn something from Mr. Scott Brown, who's had over 30 years in the food processing industry as both a chef and as a project manager. And as a thoughtful pursuer of health and fitness for his home and his self, he has a very unique perspective that I think you'll learn from. But before we get to that conversation, a couple pieces of housekeeping. First, a huge shout out to one of our amazing sponsors, Slice PT. Chris Vanderslice is the owner and operator of Slice PT out of Chester, New Jersey, and he just opened their very first brick and mortar studio in Chester, New Jersey. So if you're over that way, I highly recommend that you go check it out. Coach Vanderslice has been in the business for over 20 years, and he does group training, personal training, and virtual coaching. And his specialty is balancing the positivity you need to stay encouraged on your fitness journey with the hardcore attitude that won't let you give up on yourself. Chris and I have known each other for several years, and as a fellow father who's working hard to define Dad Bod for his two boys, I couldn't recommend anyone else more highly. You can find out more about Slice PT at www.slicept.com. That's www.slicept.com. Thank you, Slice PT, for your support of Defining Dad Bod. And my next piece of housekeeping is to you, the listener, to say thank you very much for bearing with my crazy July schedule. We don't do much travel, but this month found me both in California and in Arkansas for an extended period of time. And that made it nearly impossible to put out anything useful to you guys, either via podcast or video. And so thank you for your continued support and following the show as we resume a normal schedule for the fall, putting out new content every week, both on our social media platforms and here on the podcast. We've got some amazing question and answer, transformation story, interviews, and crazy good content with regard to finishing the series, Overcoming Obesity, and starting a new series about exercise and the brain. I'm going to make sure that you have everything you need to be inspired and equipped walking into the holidays this year, so that 2018 can be a springboard for you into 2019 with regard to your health and fitness. Thanks so much for following the show. And if you haven't been recently, check out www.patreon.com/definingdadbod. I've made several updates to enhance the rewards that we're giving our patrons, including a 16-week program to help you walk through the hormone pyramid on your own time to get your insulin, cortisol, testosterone, and thyroid hormones working for you rather than against you to define your dad bod. Again, you can get connected to that at www.patreon.com/definingdadbod. And now, without further ado, let's get to that conversation with Scott Brown. What's up, guys? This is Alex Van Houten with Defining Dad Bod. I hope you're doing well. I'm here with a good friend, Mr. Scott Brown, and we are even better friends now that we've had this conversation already, but you, the listener, didn't get to hear it because we weren't recording. So, what we're going to do today with Mr. Scott is actually have a conversation about processed food, and I'm going to let him introduce his background because it's a really exciting topic and we got really deep with some stuff. We're going to follow some rabbit trails along the way. You can find Mr. Scott at DevChef, that's DevChef, both on Facebook and Twitter. Scott, how you doing today, brother?
I'm doing awesome, man. Enjoying the heat.
It's a little warm up there, I'm sure. And it's warm here, too. Scott, you're in Canada, correct?
Yeah, I'm just outside of Toronto, and we're in the middle of a heat wave, so I'm enjoying it.
So nice. Actually, fun fact, my wife, toddler, and I, which I wouldn't recommend traveling with a 3-year-old if you can help it. We couldn't help it, so we actually went on a trip to California recently, more for business than for pleasure, and we expected going south that somehow it would be warmer because that's how things usually go. Man, we froze our butts off. It was so cold next to the ocean.
No way.
Yeah. Go figure.
Wow.
Go figure. So that's the weather is not at all what we're talking about today, though. So let's dive into your story, man, because this topic is a huge one, the topic of processed foods. It's got this big, giant red flag, big scary monster in the closet kind of connotation when people talk in the health and fitness world about processed food. However, you have a very deep and powerful background in both the development of food processes and the cooking and the health and fitness aspect of foods as well. So how about you give us a little bit about your story? From childhood all the way through to how you got to doing what you're doing today, so that we get a sense of the depth of your knowledge in this field.
Okay, sure, Alex. Like you said, I've seen all facets of the business, the food business, and it's quite interesting, and it still fascinates me today, and I still learn so much every single day. It's just a fascinating industry to be in. So, I grew up in northern New Brunswick on the eastern side of Canada in a family of 8 children with a very busy environment. So the food was always a big part of our lives and still is today. So all the gatherings happened around food. And my mother was a great cook. She could do a lot with very little. And as you can imagine, cooking for 8 kids and trying to manage that from an economic perspective, you have to be pretty smart. So she could do a lot of things with very, very little. We often ate seasonally. We ate what was coming out of the ocean. So, we were beside the Atlantic Ocean. So we ate a lot of fish and seafood. I remember, 5 years old having to eat salted cod, which really stunk the house up because you had to soak it. And it was a long process and it was really fishy. But my father had a rule that we weren't allowed to leave the table till all our food was eaten. And we had to because, food waste was not an acceptable thing. So that was ingrained in my mind from a really young age. So I learned to develop a palate for all different types of food. A lot of things that kids are very fussy about, like, smoked fish, smoked mackerel and salted fishes. And I just developed a palate for great food from an early age. Mind you, during tough times, my mother could do wicked things with Campbell's cream of mushroom soup and a can of tuna and some bread. Tuna on toast, she used to call it. So she was very versatile. She did what she had to do. And so it gave me a great respect for food. And then I got into the food industry when I was 17. I became a cook at the local A&W, which my aunt managed. And then within 2 or 3 months, I was pretty much running the kitchen. And then I went on and took the traditional route of going to university. And after my second year of studying sociology, I just had this yearning to follow food. So I went to chef school and did that for 2 years. And then after that, I traveled quite a lot. I worked in Switzerland and Italy for a couple of years and then came back to Canada and just traveled around Canada from east to west, working in hotels and restaurants, and then eventually worked my way up to executive chef in good 4- and 5-star hotels. And I also taught cooking. I taught baking to first-year students at the Culinary Institute of Canada in Prince Edward Island for 3 years. Then went back into the industry. And then one day I saw an ad in the paper for a development chef for a seafood company. And so I thought, this sounds really interesting. Going to go apply for it. So I ended up getting the job, and it was for a small seafood processor. So they made frozen hors d'oeuvres, things like bacon wrapped scallops and crab cakes and a lot of handmade small appetizers for private label supermarkets and for food service. So, restaurants that wanted to buy handmade quality products. And so I was there for 6 years. When I started, the company we were at around 3 million in sales, annual sales. And when I left, we were up to 15 million. So it was really, really fast growth. And the great thing about that job is I learned so much during that period of time. I became, aside from developing the products, I was the quality assurance manager. I was involved in procurement. I was involved in costing. And it was just a very small management team. You know, there was 5 of us that made decisions. So we're able to develop things very quickly and move very fast. And just a phenomenal growth opportunity. And at that time, I also studied food science. So I started studying food science online courses through different universities in the U.S. and started to understand that part really, really well. And what's interesting is I had already had a fairly good grasp of food science, because when you teach and study baking, baking's all about percentages, and it's about chemical leavenings, and it's very different from cooking. There's a lot more science involved to it. So I had already had a good respect and understanding for that side of the business. So fast forward to today, when I was at that job, that first job that I had as a development chef, I got a call from the employer I'm currently at today asking me if I would be interested in director of product development for that company. And so, 4 interviews later, I ended up taking that job, and that's where I've been for the last 11 years. So today I work for a company called Highliner Foods, and we're Canada's leading brand of frozen seafood, and we also have a very large arm in the US as well, where we do a lot of private label products. So today what my job kind of looks like is I'm the director of product development, so I have a corporate chef and 5 food scientists who report to me. And basically what we do is we study trends, we're very up to date on what's happening in the food industry, and we develop food products that solve problems for consumers, so retail consumers, and we also develop a lot of products for hotels and restaurants. And the problems that we try to solve are to make seafood very easy to use and easy to execute, because for most people, they find cooking fish and seafood very daunting because there's so many different types of species and so many things that you need to understand and learn about. So our job is to make it simple, to keep it healthy, and really to try to get people to eat more seafood because of its health benefits. So that's pretty much my background and where it's brought me today.
Wow, man. I want to comment on your amazing depth in this industry, because it's very unique. It's very, very rare that you ever talk to somebody who is both a chef and a product development manager for any kind of company within the food science industry. So that's really powerful. Before I get there, though, I got to say, you just turned a light bulb in my head, and I grew up in a home very similar to you in that, my mom was a single parent of 4 kids, and so she could do magic with 3 ingredients. There's nothing in the pantry, but somehow something turned out on the table, and it was very similar in my house. You don't leave food on your plate. We can't afford to waste food. So that, I grew up with that, and I don't know if I learned by watching and doing with her or whatever, but I kind of inherited that magic myself, and that, I'm not a gourmet chef by any means, but I can walk into a kitchen with a few ingredients and make some magic, and everybody's happy with it. But I've always said I'm a great cook, but I suck at baking, and I think you just hit the nail on the head, and I don't know why it didn't turn the light on. But you said there's a lot more science to baking, because you actually have to measure the ingredients, and when you're cooking, you're kind of like Emerald Live, bam, here's some seasoning, and bam, I'm going to throw that in. You can't do that with baking. Your cookies don't turn out.
Very good observation, Alex. And I've seen some of your food posts on Facebook, and you do a great job in the kitchen, man. Kudos to you. But yes, baking, to a lot of chefs, they stay away from baking because it intimidates them, because you can't freestyle it. And if you don't have the discipline in baking to follow something properly, you can't just fix it. You can't add a little bit more salt or tweak it. If you don't follow it, it ain't going to happen.
Wow. Just blew my mind. All right, I'm going to spare everybody else for my epiphany right now, but I'm actually going to think about that while I'm trying to sleep tonight. So let's talk about that passion and what it's really resulted in now. So just a quick recap. You, in your young life, developed a passion around food because it's something that it was organic, but it was also a pretty deep, and I don't mean organic as in no pesticides. I mean organic as in this was life. This is how we did things at my house, so to speak. This is how we did things with my brothers and sisters. This is how we did things with my parents. And in that passion that you developed, you went to school for it. And not only was it a passion, it became a career for you. And 30 years in the industry or so, you've brought yourself to this point where we can have a ridiculously intelligent conversation about processed food, and not just intelligent, but passionate. So help me out here, Scott. Processed food is a buzzword in the fitness industry because, I've been a trainer for almost 14 years, and I have said out of my own mouth many times to clients, I need you to avoid processed foods for the next few months. Now, that's just a really big blanket statement. What the heck is processed food, and why is it such a hot topic right now?
Yeah, that is a phenomenal question, and you and I could probably talk for days on it, Alex, but I'll try to keep it short. I think it's, in my opinion, if I was teaching a student about this, I would try to guide them down the path of understanding where processed food came from and why it's so important to us today, to help you see it from a broader perspective. So if you think about it, processed food has been around since the Stone Age, from when we started to take a grain of wheat and turn it into flour. That was a process. And the processes were made to help us survive. So, and then taking that flour that's been ground down and adding water to it and making a dough was a process. And then another mistake happened where that dough was left out in the sun for a couple of days, and it started to gather the bacteria that was naturally in the air, and it developed natural yeast. So another process began, and that heavy dough that they used to have to eat then became leavened with this natural yeast. And so things just began to improve through processes. So we were able to preserve our meat for longer periods of time when we found that when we salted it and it dried, we didn't need refrigeration. Well, they didn't have refrigeration back then, so they needed to figure out ways to preserve their food. Another good one, I think it dates back to like 5000 BC, was the original cheese making. Cheese making happened as a result of curdled milk and salt that made the cheese form into a solid mass, and the salt preserved it. So, in hot countries in Asia, where they didn't have refrigeration, the salt would make this milk edible. And so it sustained people.
Wait, let me make sure I get this straight. Bread, cheese, and maybe even beer, all of those were accidents that we enjoy today?
Yes, the way that I understand it and the way that I read it, yes. And so, like wine, for instance, was grape juice that was allowed to ferment. So, the three great things in life were all accidents.
Take that.
Yeah. And so, when we start to come up towards the Industrial Revolution, that really took food processing to a whole new level. And if we think about pasteurization, where we were able to take milk and make it safe, that was a huge advance in food processing that went on to other sources of food later in life. But then we get into spray drying and canning and evaporation, and those are things that happened during the wars that helped make food portable so the soldiers could survive, and the families that were left here could also have food that was more shelf stable and more economical for them, because the Depression brought about a lot of great new food processes, because out of necessity, again, we had to figure out ways to make food more accessible and cheaper. It was sad to see food that was going bad because there was no way to preserve it during the Depression at a time when you really needed it so badly. We could go on and you could see the progression of food processing and how it improved our lives to the state of today. If we look at some of the things that we consider to be really healthy, like smoothies that are based on protein powders, that's a form of food processing, where you take the whey, or if it's pea protein or whatever, those ingredients are processed in such a way that we make them shelf stable and we turn them into something that we perceive to be very healthy. So dried fruit, trail mix, power bars, even juice. It's all a form of food processing. And that's made our lives very, very convenient and much, much easier today than they would have been 50 years ago. I mean, we can literally grab food in a package and take it with us and get our sustenance and our health. Baby food's another great example of food processing that made food very, very easy for children to digest. Gluten-free today. So, 10 years ago, gluten-free bread was horrible. It was not palatable. Today, you can get great gluten-free breads that are almost exactly the same as breads with gluten, right? They have that nice chewy structure. That's a form of food processing, and it's also a form of, or an example of, where food science actually helped us.
So a trainer sipping on his protein shake while telling his client not to eat processed food is kind of a fun, ironic dichotomy for you, is it not?
Exactly.
So help me understand then, because there is a ridiculous amount of utility and benefit to the processes that we know for food today. I, for one, am appreciative that my son can drink a glass of milk without, I would love to drink a glass of milk, but lactose and I just don't mix. So, which is unfortunate because ice cream's amazing. So I let my son drink a glass of milk and I don't have to worry that, for the next 3 days, he's going to be roiling in agony because of the bacteria that was eliminated through pasteurization. I can appreciate that amazingly. So what is the dark side of processed foods then? Because, it sounds like you can't eat lettuce without having had it, it's sprayed so it's crisp. It came from hundreds of miles away and somehow it arrives in beautiful condition on your grocery store shelf. Or, the milk pasteurization example, bread's a wonderful example as well. So what about the dark side? Why is it that processed food gets a bad rap as well? Because there is such a thing as heavily processed food, and I have a hard time understanding how we as the consumer really tell the difference.
Processed foods definitely have their drawbacks. I guess I would say overly processed food. So an example of overly processed food is basically something that starts out with an identity. So if we take chicken, for example, and we turn it into chicken nuggets, well, if you look at the ingredient statement on a chicken nugget and you see that chicken's not the first ingredient and say it's wheat or something else, then we've taken chicken and we've made it a secondary ingredient. So that, in my opinion, is a good example of an overly processed food. So what happens there is your nutritional density gets decreased. And then if we look at things like, say, canned products, so there's an example of where food processing can actually destroy vitamins. So it's not to say that a canned product is not good. It's not going to be as nutritionally dense as, say, a fresh vegetable or a fresh fruit, or say even a frozen fruit is much better. So if you understand the process itself and what it does to the food, I think that's really, really helpful. So, canned fruit, the heat that's applied in canning will decrease the nutritional density. I think it's understanding food additives and what those food additives do. So, for instance, when there's excessive sugars put into foods that normally don't have those sugars, that, of course, the sugar risk is going to vary from person to person. If you're pre-diabetic, if you have any health concerns that you're predisposed to. I also think it's really important to understand what's considered an additive. So there's things that you may not understand on a label, things like xanthan gum or carrageenan. Understand what those are and what their functions are. So in a lot of cases, you might see a news flash about carrageenan being carcinogenic, and it is. But the key thing to understand there is something like carrageenan, it's carcinogenic at a very, very high level. So you would have to eat quite a bit of the product to be harmed by it. So it's taking those headlines that you see and really understanding a little bit deeper about what they are. And I know for the average consumer, it's confusing. It's a lot to digest because they've got information coming at them from so many sources. So, at the end of the day, it's about educating yourself as much as you can. The other thing about highly processed food is sodium is often used. However, there are some foods that naturally have a lot of sodium in them. So, smoked salmon, cheese. Sodium plays an important part in those ingredients. So if you have prosciutto, for instance, which is a beautifully, nicely aged leg of pork, the beauty of that product is it's a delicacy. It's a great thing to have, but it's high in sodium. So you're not going to eat a pound of that. You're probably only going to eat about 20 or 30 grams and really enjoy it. So again, that's an example of a processed food, but it's actually very, very natural. The only ingredient in it is pork and salt. But it can be a wonderful thing to enjoy if you understand how it's processed and what the function of the ingredient is in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important for the listeners to know, Scott is not, this, no offense to anybody out there, he's not this slightly chubby chef guy who's an executive for food industries and sitting behind his desk going, haha, you guys should eat everything. And I'm really trying to confuse you. If you actually go to his social media stuff, this guy is extremely dead set on and committed to the idea of leaving a legacy of health and fitness. And it's powerful to watch him do what he does. And so while he's talking here, one of the things that I'm hearing is that it's important that we as a consumer are extremely educated on what it is that we're putting into our bodies and to know the difference between like a media hype that labels ingredients as, this is really bad. And then also knowing what it is that's worth putting into our face and in what amounts, right? So when we say heavily processed food, it sounds to me, Scott, like the big things to avoid are an excessive amount of sugar and then an excessive amount of salt if the salt isn't necessary for the preservation process in like prosciutto or cheese, for instance. And then if you're somebody who's sensitive to salt, you probably shouldn't be eating those things very much to begin with.
That's right, Alex. It's really about understanding the function of all those ingredients. It's helpful to understand the history too behind those things. Like, I use the example of prosciutto and cheese, but they're age-old food processes that have been around forever. But those foods weren't meant to be eaten in high abundance. They are things that you eat small amounts of.
Absolutely.
And so if you know how much sodium is in there and what your daily requirement for sodium is, then you are now empowered to make great food choices.
100 years ago, you might have eaten cheese, and I'm not talking about the Kraft singles. I'm talking about a legitimate block of cheddar cheese. You might have eaten cheese maybe once or twice a year, not every single day for 3 meals a day, and the salt wouldn't have been a problem 100 years ago. Whereas, if you're eating it 3 or 4 times a day, you're throwing it on your omelet, you're putting it on your bacon cheeseburger, you're eating it as a snack between meals because it's high in protein, then the salt's going to be a problem.
That's a great example, Alex. Absolutely. Yeah.
I used to be a cheese addict. I'll just say that, from one cheese addict to... There is life after cheese addiction, guys, just so you know. So let's right. So let's talk about some important things that a consumer can do to make the best decision about what they put in their body. So I hear you talking about the message of being an informed consumer about what you put into your body. Do you have any advice for my listeners about how they can be more informed consumers and how they can better know what they're putting in their body?
Yeah, so I think there's 2 things. Is learn what ingredients are. If you look at a label, if you see an ingredient that you don't understand, look it up, Google, maybe even call the brand. If it's a brand that you buy a lot and you value that brand, they usually have a 1-800 number. Give them a call and ask them, what is this ingredient and why do you put it in there? Learn to read labels, really, is basically what I'm saying. And if it's a long ingredient statement, I hear people say, don't buy anything unless it's got more than 5 ingredients in it. I don't think that's rational thinking. Protein powder, for instance, I've got some Vega protein powder that I just bought at Costco, and I think that's got 10 ingredients in it, but I know every single ingredient, and I know why it's there, and I'm totally cool with it. So, read those labels, understand the ingredients that are in the labels. The other thing that I think that's really important that I feel is missing is for people to know their bodies and know how your body reacts. So, for instance, I stopped eating cheese 2 years ago because even though I loved it, I felt heavy and bloated. And so I said, I'm going to try removing this and see what happens. So I stopped eating cheese, and about 6 weeks later, I really started to see the results. I felt, much lighter. And then 6 years ago, I did the same thing with meat. I just stopped eating meat because I wanted to find out what would happen. And sure enough, the same thing. So I learned that my body doesn't respond well to meat, and it doesn't respond well to cheese. And so today I'm a pescatarian. I eat a lot of fish and I eat a lot of vegetables. I also know that sugar, I have a weakness for sugar. So yes, I try to be healthy, but man, I struggle with sugar, and I know that for me, sugar sends that dopamine message to my brain and makes me happy. I've got to really watch my sugar intake because for me, it's like a drug. So if I buy something that is processed, I really look at the label and see where sugar sits on that label. If it's high sugar, I stay away from it because I know how my body responds. So I think those two things are really, really important is respect your body. Your body is your temple. So you're not going to build your temple with cheap materials. So if you think of it that way, understand every single ingredient that you're putting into building that temple of yours and see where that takes you.
I love that. I'm reminded as you're speaking of, it's actually kind of a funny skit by Louis C.K. He's a little bit of a crass comedian, so if you don't like that kind of thing, don't look it up. But he's talking about, I can see myself eating a piece of salmon, and it enters my body, and my body digests it, and those nutrients get to my cells, and my body says, hey, I can do something with this. We can build some muscle, we can build some enzymes, we can do all kinds of good stuff with this. And then I eat a donut, and my body can't even get through digesting it before it looks at it and goes, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? I don't even know. I don't even know what to make out of that. So I love that. I love you're talking, and I'm chuckling to myself, trying not to laugh through what you're saying because
I love that.
Yeah, it's a really good way to wrap your head around that, and it kind of brings us back to the beginning of the conversation when you were talking about identifying when a food's heavily processed. If you know what the food is supposed to be, and the first 2 ingredients aren't even that food itself, that's a really good rule of thumb. And you brought another piece that we use in my house, which is counting your sugar. I am much more of a sugar fiend than my wife is, but after 1 or 2 cookies, I can't stop. So we just don't keep them around.
Same here, Alex. Yeah.
That serves our household well. My clients oftentimes will say, how do you do it? How do you balance, good nutrition? And I say, I'm actually way less disciplined than I would like you to think I am. I just control my environment well, and that does a lot of good for me.
Oh, yeah. That's a great tip. And one other thing that just came to mind when you talked about Louis C.K. that has been really helpful for me in the last few months is mindful eating. So I read a lot about mindfulness. And this friend of mine came back from a mindfulness retreat in upstate New York. And she shared with me about their experience with mindful eating. So mindful eating is literally, looking at every bite. And this is extreme, I know, but you can use elements of it. But looking at your food and slowly putting it in your mouth and slowly chewing it and thinking about the taste, texture, and just enjoying it. Just the same way we would in, being mindful about the moment or being mindful about the conversation that we're in. being mindful with your food. And some of the things that I've been reading say, if you're mindful about your meals and you really take your time and you think about it, you generally eat about 15 to 20% less than you normally would, because you're not just shoveling the food into your mouth, you're actually enjoying it. So my wife and I have been doing that for the last couple of months, and I gotta tell you, man, when you just have the ability to stop for a minute and say, oh, you know what, I'm eating too fast, let's slow down and enjoy this, it makes eating so much better. And my sense tells me that you probably digest it a lot better too, because there's less stress in your body, you're calmer, and I bet you probably metabolize it better. Again, I've got no proof of that, but instinctually it just feels great. So, if any of your listeners out there are struggling with weight, when you start mindfully eating and you start looking around, so if you're in a restaurant and you start looking around, you just see people like shoveling this food into their mouths, and it's like, slow down, really savor the taste of that food. Boy, it makes a big difference.
Plus, it reminds me of those archetypal movies where like some caveman's brought back to life from the ice or something. And he's at the dinner table eating pizza for the first time, and he's like, oh, this is so good. And so I imagine dinner at your house as a party. That's great, though. It's aside from my weird ADD memory of Hollywood as a child, the idea of mindfully consuming your food actually, not only does it help you digestively speaking, because a lot of people don't know, digestion actually begins in the mouth. Chewing your food, when you actually chew through it and you use your teeth it's a mechanical process. You're actually processing your food for your body, breaking it down into smaller pieces and increasing your surface area. When you do that mindfully, you actually chew about 20% to 50% more. They've actually tested this, how many times people chew when they're thinking about it. You chew quite a bit more, and you give an opportunity for the enzymes in your saliva to go to work. And so there are some who say that you should drink your food, as in chew it so well that it goes down easy, rather than, shoveling it down and swallowing chunks at a time. And that actually does help your digestive system roll through a lot faster. I don't know if they've correlated that mindful chewing with decreased indigestion, but I would say it's a no-brainer at that point.
Yeah, man, that makes total sense. Total sense. Love it.
So as we're wrapping up this conversation, I want to give the listeners a few takeaways. You've heard the difference between processed food and heavily processed food. You've heard a few rules of thumb that Scott brings to his own practice in his home with regard to nutrition. And you've also heard the idea of mindful eating. And then I'd also like to throw in there, if you're thinking, wow, there's just so much to know about ingredients, you're right. We live in the age of information, and you can Google anything you'd like and generally get a great answer. I hope from a reputable source. If you have any questions about that, reach out to either Scott or myself. I'll probably refer to Scott at the point of process, to be honest. But the other thing that you can do for yourself, if you're not on the level of meditating while you eat your food, be mindful at least about what you're putting in your mouth by just journaling it. Many clients that I've worked with, their first step in getting a great understanding of what they're putting in their body is simply to write it down after they eat it. I don't care how much you ate. I really don't care what was in it. I just want you to write it down, and what happens is you start to bring your awareness to what you're putting in your body, when you're putting it into your body, and why you're doing it, whether it's an emotional thing or you were actually hungry or you're in a rush and so you just scarfed it down, that kind of stuff. We can just start to bring your awareness around what's going in your body, and then we can start talking about what's actually in that food and whether or not it's good for you.
Excellent.
Scott, do you have anything that you'd like to leave us with here as we're wrapping up our conversation? This has been a great conversation with a lot of good information, and I'd like you to have the last word.
I just think that as we're talking about food, and, I said food is the greatest gift that you give your body and your mind. If we think about everything that food gives us, it gives us our physical strength, it gives us our mental strength, because what you do eat does a lot to your psyche as well. I talked about sugar in my issues with sugar. Like sugar used to just make my brain go 1,000 miles a minute. That's not what I need, and that's not what I should have. So to me, it's listening to the body, but it's also listening to what are the messages that are going through your mind. And as we continue to think about what food does for us, I start to think about my relationships to food and what I'm eating and how I feel about what I'm eating. So I think it's important to feel good about what you're putting in your body. So what was the source? Where did that food come from? If it's an animal source, did it come from a sustainable source? Was it factory farmed? I really feel that the way an animal is treated or the way that something is grown, it goes right through to your system. And that is going to give you peace and contentment in your life when you feel good about what you're putting into your body and you feel informed and truly knowledgeable about what you're eating. And further to that, it's going to make you a great contributor in your life to your family, to society, and to work and everyone around you. And that will give you a great spirit. So it really all does start with that single thing that we put in our body. And so for me, it was, first thing I had this morning was coffee. And I love a good cup of coffee because it wakes me up and I just love the flavor of it. And that's my comfort. So after this call, I'm going to go have a nice bowl of fruit. That's going to make me feel great as well because I know that's going to give me some nice clean energy to start the day with. So it all starts with your food, guys. That would be my final message.
I appreciate that, Scott. And it makes me think about my last question to you as we wrap things up, which is the idea that not only is food a gift to yourself, especially when you're mindful about the food that you're putting in your body, but also that your habits affect the next generation. Your habits are what, drive the big giant machine of business and whatnot. And it's also what drives the habits of your household. So with that being said, Scott, my last question to you is, what does the phrase defining Dad Bod mean to you?
So I think as we think about the body, again, it's your soul, your spirit, your mind, and that physical frame that holds it all together. So I think what defines Dad Bod for me is how do all of those things come together for you as an individual, and are they in balance? Is your mind in balance with your body? Maybe you need to work more on a certain part of your body that you're feeling weak in, or maybe you need to learn more about processed food, for example. What's your body telling you? And what's it telling you from those three areas? So mind, body, and spirit. What's your body telling you? And I think as men and dads, our quest is really to try to get all of those in balance. So maybe today we're okay and we feel great about the choices we're making. And that's awesome. And we should feel good about things. As long as we're trying and we're seeking growth and we're seeking knowledge, we need to feel good about that. And we can be content in that area. If there's something that we still need to learn, that's great. But I think we should all be content in that we're at least on a quest for trying to be better men.
I love that, Scott. Thanks so much for your time today and for such a great conversation. You can catch Scott Brown at DevChef. That's DevChef, both on Facebook and Twitter. Scott, thanks so much for your time today, man.
Cheers, brother.